Well, good afternoon. Trust that this message finds you well and encouraged. The third of our series in listening and responding. Today we're going to be exploring what are the barriers to listening well. And I think we've all had those moments, and I know that I'm guilty when I want to give people my full attention, then all of a sudden something comes along that grabs my eye and takes me away from being present in the moment. And that can be so discouraging when someone is sharing very deep and personal things around and about them. So I think, one of the realities we have to recognize and not beat ourselves up over, but to be aware of the distraction of noise. The physical environment with all of its distractions play a huge part in our ability to listen well. And there are times where I've just got to let the mobile phone ring or let that text message go through. And better still, when I'm in a critical listening place, to be able to turn the mobile phone off and put it aside. And I know that for me personally, that's something I've got to continually work on. But noise is anything that interferes with the message that we're receiving. It can include those physical things. Might be an office printer. One of the reasons I've come down into the garden today is Jackie was cryovacuuming some chicken breasts in the kitchen, and you could hear the cryovac do its thing, and the ding, and or music. I waited. You might have just heard the utility go past that was parked across the road. Well, he was sitting over there having a smoko and with his music going pretty hard. So waited for that. We might have to wait for a noisy exhaust fan, or even a truck exhaust. I know that in this season when we've been recording, Luke has at times just shut down our recording while a noisy car, a noisy truck goes past, and because that physical environment is really important to good listening. Semantics, the use of language and colloquialisms, language that's confusing and full of jargon can be difficult to listen to and really understand what someone is saying. I know in Canberra, sitting around and listening to a couple of old Navy salts have a conversation, they were using language and just straight over my head. But then you've got the physiological stuff, which could be a physical headache, a migraine, or could be a chemical, biological disturbance, a fragrance, or a smell of gas, or something that interferes with our communication. Could be our sense of well-being, our sense of mental health. How are we able to listen? Is this a conversation that we can have now, or is it better that we have it another time? Then you've got those psychological noises around our own prejudices, that as we're listening to someone, we can, rather than being giving our full attention to listening, we can actually be arguing with them, and our prejudices get in the way and confuse the message. In this day and age, we run the risk of message overload. I know that by the time a day concludes and I come home from work, sometimes because I've had so many messages and conversations and telephone calls and emails, that all I want to do at night is come home, have a cup of tea and put my feet up and just catch my breath. And of course, Jackie, she's been in this season, has been home a lot, and she's wanting to interact, and it can be difficult to get beyond those things that come across our desk, the emails, the SMS messages, social media. All of that has increased so much. With smartphones and smartwatches, it's too easy to multitask when it comes to communicating while doing other things. And we just simply get exhausted with the amount of communication that comes our way every day. We switch off. It's important to make time to communicate well and listen well. So we've got message overload, but then there's message complexity. And this is when people give way more detail or use that scientific or unfamiliar language with challenging arguments that can be difficult to understand. I know I need to work on my use of language as a communicator to be able to break things down into bite-sized chunks rather than speaking about the anthropomorphisms in the book of Genesis, if you understand what I'm trying to say. If you have a theological background, maybe you will, but for the majority of us, those sorts of terms are really unhelpful. I mean, I wonder if you've ever bought a house and you get these mortgage papers that, well, I don't understand them all and it just does my head in. And I've got to rely on my legal team, that whoever is doing the conveyancing, to interpret that stuff to make it safe for me. The complexity of signing papers that seal you to a mortgage for 30 years. There's a lot to manage and listen to, and it's likely very unfamiliar and cumbersome in its language, and it'll impact your capacity to listen well. Another thought is this whole idea of a lack of training. We think that listening is a natural talent, but it's not. It really is a learned skill. Preoccupation is another barrier. Even the most skilled listeners become preoccupied at times. And I find for me, my mental health has a bit to do with that as well. If I'm stressed and stretched, I can find myself preoccupied with something menial and sit and nod and grunt, and that's not real good communication and not real good listening skill either. But that's when we become more concerned with our own experiences and everyday stressors. And then there's the listening gap. The fact is we generally think faster than we speak. And the research suggests that the average person speaks about 150 to 200 words per minute. Yet we can understand more than 800 words per minute, which is why people catch themselves completing sentences for other people. It's also why we find ourselves drifting off sometimes in mid-conversation. It's not so much that we become bored, but rather in our own heads, we've already completed the message. And closing the listening gap is a challenge for even the most attentive listener. Another barrier is that we get selective listening. I know that there are times where Jackie will say, you aren't listening. Well, I actually am, but I admit sometimes selectively. It happens when you tune out in part of the message that doesn't interest you and you tune into the part of the message that does. I think we all have our friends that are the talkaholics. Some people are so consumed with their own communication, they compulsively talk and self-reference without really disengaging from the chatter inside their own heads to listen well and to take in the story of the other. That's a massive problem if we're to engage and listen to another person's story. There's nothing worse when trying to tell your story than the listener starts responding with a bigger, grander version. Oh yeah, that was like, oh, I remember when. Rather than actually listening to what your experience is, you step straight in to your own. Then there's the pseudo-listening. It's where you kind of go, yeah, yeah. And it's about faking attention or pretending to listen by nodding our heads and looking at the speaker and smiling at appropriate times, putting in the occasional, yeah. I know that when Jackie thinks I'm pseudo-listening, she will say some of the most outrageous things, and I say, well, hang on, sweetheart, I really am listening. You see, it's our nearest and dearest that will actually help us understand how good our listening really is. You see, to overcome the tendency of pseudo-listening, center your attention on the other speaker. And then there's the other bit of gap filling can be a barrier, where you run ahead because you think you can correctly guess the rest of the story and fill the conversation in. Even though the issue might be familiar, it's actually about giving the speaker the opportunity to tell their story, their experience, because usually it's very, very different to our own. You might be surprised with the outcome. And then there's the defensive listening, and that's the listening where we feel under threat, where we feel that the communication we've received potentially is combative or accusative, and we have our triggers hit, and we begin to feel like that we're experiencing a personal attack or a hostile criticism, when really someone is just simply trying to find words to express what's going on for them. The final thought around the barriers is the practice of ambushing, and there's nothing worse really. And that's when someone will listen carefully to a message and then in a subsequent conversation use that information to attack the individual that they're ambushing. Ambushing diminishes trust and should be avoided at all costs. If I've had a conversation yesterday, I'm happy to refer to it on the basis that it's positive and life-giving and it tends to helping someone move forward, rather than turning around and using the information that I received yesterday as a club or a hammer today. So how do we overcome poor listening habits? Well, I think the selective listening problem: embrace the entire message, be patient and wait and engage. If we happen to suffer with using too many words and talkaholism, think about putting yourself in the other's shoes. If we're pseudo-listening, center your attention on the speaker and wholly engage. If we suffer with gap filling, fill that space by summarizing the message or clarifying. Am I hearing you say this? Am I understanding this right? Summarize the message and get it clear in your own head. The defensive listening problem: keep your own self-concept in check, because often what the other is sharing is not about you, but it is about them. And when it comes to ambushing, learn to play fair. Learn to play fair in conversations. So the exercise to explore is to think of some, what are the noises in your communication channel? You might think it's impossible to rid yourself of that noise. Noise can distort the reception of a message and negatively affect the meaning of transmission. So, what suggestions do you have to get rid of various types of noises that you have to deal with in your listening? I guess to consider what is a positive listening style and an engaging listening style, well, I think people-centered listening. You find a compromise in common areas of interest, an intersection of life. And then you've got action-centered listening. Helps a speaker stay on track and enables the focus to grow around the point of their message. Action-centered listening will clarify, and am I understanding, and am I getting this right? It sounds to me like this is what you're saying. Am I getting that straight? Content-centered listening focuses on the facts. Hey, I've just heard you say this. Is that right? They consider all sides of the issues. You know, I've just heard you say this. Have you thought about perhaps that? Or it's not just about you presenting your preferred position, but rather you can consider the challenging information that's coming toward you. Should that be the case? And then you've got time-centered listening. Let the other person know that there are limits to your time. Set clear expectations for the conversation at the beginning. It's often I'll say to someone, hey, you know, I've got an hour before my next appointment, so I really want to make it count. I don't want to rush our time together, so can we get down? And I mention that simply today so that we can have the most enjoyable time together. And I think to remember, often the major issue that someone will present to you is usually the last issue, and sometimes you've got to listen for 40, 45, 50 minutes to actually hear what the problem is, or what the concern is, or what the issue is that's central to the message that's being communicated. So you might recognize that that's people-centered, action-centered, content-centered, and time-centered. So that's about making a pact that you can communicate and improve your capacity to communicate by improving your capacity to listen. In the document that goes with this presentation, there are some key questions for you to reflect on, to consider for application. So I trust that you'll find that exercise helpful. And then there's a communication assessment test, which is about you listening to yourself and surveying how you're going with your communication. Where are your strengths? Where are those things that you need to grow in? And I hope that this will help us all become more effective listeners as we journey forward. God bless you all. Thank you.